Catherine McNulty here with Grief Inspired. I've really been enjoying the live streams because I love to have you all participate. So I want to talk today about getting unstuck. I hear all of the time, I get email after email that says, I am stuck and I don't know what to do. They can be stuck in anger, depression, guilt. And when we say getting unstuck, I want to talk about what we mean. I want to talk about what resilience is. I want to talk about the process of getting up. So I think what I'm going to do is do this live stream to introduce the concepts around how to get unstuck. But I think it's so important that I may do a couple of different follow-up videos because I just think it's so important. And when I was preparing some content, I have a lot here. And so I'm gonna break it up into a couple of different live streams or maybe some videos, but please provide me your feedback as we go along, because getting unstuck is a really difficult place to be, particularly when you're in grief. And I found that some people will stay stuck for a very long time. And that's what we don't want. It is a fundamental belief of GriefInspired that the way to move through your grief is to move through your grief, is to look at it, is to deal with it, is to process. And that the sooner you can do those things, the quicker you can get to a place where you feel like you've healed, where you can sit with your grief and it doesn't overwhelm you. You can sit with your grief and you're not riddled with guilt. You can sit with your grief and yes, be sad, but be okay and have what we call that level of acceptance and realizing that this has happened, this is the life that I have, and then really having a path and a plan for what do I do next, right? So the tagline for GriefInspired is a path to happiness after loss. And I find that some people say, well, I'll never be happy again. I'll always be depressed. I'll always be sad. There will always be this void. And to those people, I would say, yes, there will always be a void. It's called loss for a reason. And, but there's also an opportunity to find something new. And when we talk about getting unstuck, we have to talk about building resilience. And so that's what I want to talk about today, because building resilience is something that I personally continue to do, right? So it isn't a destination, so to speak. It is a tool. You know, I am all about tools. I am all about being in the practice. With the loss of my dad on July 29th, I am in practice yet again. And just like all of you, I was stuck in my own grief, right? And as much as I know about grief and as many people as I've talked to, and I consider myself to be an expert here, it doesn't mean that you can't get stuck. But what it does mean is that you go back to your tools. And what it does mean is that you have an opportunity to continue to build resistance. And my bounce back, as I call it, I think is shorter than it has been in the past. Because again, it's a practice and a tool, and resilience is something that you build over time. So let's talk about what resilience is so that we're all on the same page. I have the definition here. When you look up the definition of resilience, it is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. It also says to spring back into shape. And there was also the word elasticity. So if you think of a piece of elastic that stretches out and then pulls back, I think resilience is that capacity to recover, is the capacity to go into the depths of despair, to go into guilt, to be absorbed by anger as you're grieving, but also to be able to pull it back and not have it be all consuming, right? Because what happens when we are stuck, when we are consumed by our guilt or by our anger or by our sadness, there is no room for anything else. So resilience is that elasticity, being able to bounce back. And what happens over time is as you build resistance, they call it a resistance muscle. Your resistance muscle gets strengthened. And so that ability that you have to bounce back gets stronger. And so you can think of it as, depending on how many times you've lost someone that you love, every time you go through the grief process, you build your grief resiliency muscle. So my muscle, because of what's happening with my dad and because of my loss, I'm building that resilience muscle yet again, so that when, God forbid, I hate to even think about it, when my mother, who's 86 right now, when she passes, my resiliency muscle will be stronger than it is right now because of going through the grief of my father. So I hope that makes sense. Again, so resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. In this case, we're talking about to recover from the depths of despair and grief, from all the challenges that grief brings to all of us. And you can't really talk about resiliency. You can't talk about getting back up after you've been knocked in the teeth. I've had some people say that being stuck in grief feels a lot like I had one client say, she said, my feet feel like they're stuck in concrete, like I can't move. How does being stuck, how does that show up for you? I want you to write in the comments, what does stuck look like for you? If you had to define your way of being stuck, what does it mean? Does it mean that, Carol, you can't get past your anger, right? You can't control it. Is that being stuck for you? Is it being unable to want to go out of the house? Can that be a stuck? Is it not being able to have any moments of joy? Is that you're stuck? Or is your stuck even bigger than that and saying, I don't even know. I feel so stuck, I can't even define it. So we do want to define what our stuck is. Yes, and Carol, for sure, loss forever changes us. We will never be the same as we once were, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, one of the traps that we really have to worry about here is people will say, and you'll hear yourself say it, and I said it early on, is like, I just want to feel normal again. I just want to go back to the way I was. And that's a trap of grief, because you cannot go back because of what you've experienced, because of what you know. You can't go back. And so that's why we say the path is forward. And so the question then becomes is, how do I be resilient? How do I get unstuck? And how do I move forward? And that's what we're talking about today. So you can't talk about resilience without talking about Brene Brown's book, Rising Strong. I meant to have it, and it's over there. Her book, Rising Strong, talks about the human capacity to get back up again after, she says, failure, after things happen to us, right? So she works a lot in the corporate world, working with people, with teams of people, but she also works individually, and she is a researcher, and she analyzes people's behavior. And what I love about her work is she goes and talks to thousands of people and says, you know, what is resiliency to you? What does that look like? And she takes all of that data and she pulls it together. But when she talks about resiliency, her book is called Rising Strong, because what you will notice is that there are things that are very tragic that happen to different people, and different people respond to it differently. Some people have a very strong resiliency muscle and can seem to bounce back very quickly. And some people have a muscle that is less strong. And so maybe that's where we get stuck and it takes longer. And so the question becomes is what's the difference there, right? Because if you have lost a spouse or a child or someone that you desperately, desperately love, what's the difference between you who feel completely stuck and someone who seems to be okay and moving forward? And sometimes that's resiliency muscle. So we want to talk about that. In her book, Brene always starts with vulnerability, that we have to be vulnerable, that we have to be okay to really just say, like, this is a little bit bigger than me. Like, I don't understand grief. I don't understand my emotions. I don't necessarily understand everything that's happening to me. And if you're like me, I like control. And that took a while because I didn't want to admit that I didn't have control. I didn't want to admit that this was bigger than me, that I didn't know how to do it. And so we can dive into these more, but her 3 bullet points in terms of the process to resiliency and to rising strong are called the reckoning, the rumble, and the revolution. And I'm just going to go through these really quickly. Again, we can dive into these more, but basically when she says the reckoning, it's recognizing what you're feeling. It's knowing what you go through. It's Carol saying, what am I so angry about? It is saying, why do I feel so stuck? Why do I have a fear of leaving the house? What do I had somebody ask me this today. She says, I don't want to go out. I'm so scared I'm going to see somebody that I know. Well, what is the fear behind that? What do you think is going to happen? What is the worst case scenario that gives you anxiety, right? So recognizing what you're feeling and saying, I'm fearful. Like, that's why I don't want to leave the house. Or I'm very angry and I seem to not be able to control my anger. Or I'm just so sad. And then getting curious about it and saying, why? Well, why is that, right? And so all of these things, it's looking at it and getting curious and saying, well, how does that show up for me? And what does that mean? Like, what are the thoughts that are going off in my head? In the courses that I run, we talk a lot about what are we thinking? Because what are we thinking is what dictates how we feel. So we talk about that. So that's the reckoning, right? So recognizing what you're feeling and then getting curious about it. The rumble is getting honest and saying what I'm feeling and the way I'm behaving and what's happening. Is this good for me? Do I want to stay in anger? Do I want to stay in contention with other people? Do I want to stay overwhelmed by my own guilt? Do I want to stay feeling this sad? Sorry. Do I want to stay feeling this sad for this long? And then saying, okay, well, if I don't, how do I need to shift my thinking? What is a new perspective? What is a new way of looking at things? Again, big component to what we do in the grief course is look at these things and see what's going on. So that's the rumble. And then finally, there's the revolution. When you can take a minute and understand that sometimes you need to look at things a little bit differently. Sometimes you need a perspective when we are stuck in our thoughts, and we need to build resiliency. We need to find a new perspective. How did somebody else get unstuck? How did somebody else overcome their grief, right? That's why these videos, I hope, are helpful. Let's learn from other people and what did they did. And then there's growth. And if you can control what you're thinking, if you can analyze what you're thinking, if you can transform what you're thinking and get a new perspective, you can grow And then that becomes integrated into the rest of your life because now you know something that you didn't know before. Going back to what Carol said with like, you're never going to be the same. Absolutely, you're not going to be the same because you've grown. Grief will absolutely grow you if you let it, and then you will be more resilient. You will be likely a more compassionate and better person. I talk about that all the time. I am 100 times more compassionate than I was before my loss. I really look at my life and I'm like, well, I was really self-centered and really only cared about myself. Grief taught me how to care about other people in a much better way, along with a whole slew of other things. And that's a whole nother video of the things that my grief has taught me. So I think I'm going to stop there. But the reality is that if we are stuck, we need to get unstuck. How do we get unstuck? We get unstuck by building resilience. How do you build resilience? I like Brene Brown's methodology to rising strong, and that is the reckoning, the rumble, and the revolution. And I think that that's what we do in my grief courses, is to look at it all in more detail and really analyze it and see how it's showing up for you. Yes, well, Janet, you were a compassionate person to begin with. But yeah, but grief will grow you for sure. And I have lots of people who have said, well, I feel terrible now that I know what being in grief is. I feel terrible for all the people who I didn't respond to earlier when they were going through a loss. And again, it's not something to beat yourself up with. It's something to say, well, I was in one place before, and now I'm in another place, and I've grown and I've transformed and I've integrated the lessons from my grief into my life. And that realistically is what GriefInspired is about. It's being inspired to look at your grief, and it's being inspired to take what you've learned from your grief and do something with it. Put it out in the world, connect with somebody else, share your story, and then maybe it can transform into something even more. But yesterday was Self-Care Saturday. If you're in my Facebook group, if you're not, find me on Facebook. You can look at under GriefInspired, join that group so that we can talk to each other more. And Self-Care Saturday, yeah, I had to go back to all of my tools and say, okay, now I'm the one in grief again. What do I do? And I wasn't able to communicate with a lot of people. I took a couple of weeks off, and I had to go back to my tools, and I had to say, like, what is the self-care that I need? And again, this is because I put it into practice, and I've tried different things in the past. And so I know now what self-care works for me. For me, I got on my yoga mat again. For me, I got in my bathtub again, because that helps. I have a fancy new jetted tub in my new house here. I was using that every single day because I know that helps. I know that I need to build mindset when I get depressed, when I get down, when I start to get into my own spiral. And so I have motivational things that I listen to fire me up, to get my head screwed on right. Those are things that I do. I remember that I need to eat better. I started taking supplements. I stopped drinking as much as I was because that's a depressant. I eliminated caffeine because that is a stimulant, and that can make me more anxious. So those are my things. And again, in the course, we talk about self-care, and we talk about different ways to find self-care for ourselves. And when we find care for ourselves, we open up a place to have other people want to be around us. When we're not, no one wants to be around us when we are miserable. when we are super angry, when we just bitch all the time. No one wants to be around that. So if you can take care of yourself first on your own, then you can be in a place to begin to reach out. But I think taking care of yourself and finding what you need is really the first step. And I do that internally first because that's my personality. If you are someone who needs to be around people all the time and you are charged by people, you gain energy from being with other people, then maybe you need to go as a form of self-care and be with other people. And if you don't have people to be with, find a community where you can just be in the presence of other people, right? Be around other people in a mall setting, in a church, anywhere where people congregate, even going out to a park and just sitting where there's other people around, can really make a difference when you're feeling alone. So I hope this all helps. I want to talk more about building resilience. I want to ask you, where do you think you are with your resilience muscle? Do you feel like you're stuck? If you are, let me know where you think you're stuck and why you think you're stuck. And again, if you've made progress, I'm sure you have. If you've been watching my videos, I'm sure that you've made progress. So also give yourself credit for anything that you've already overcome, for the areas where you've gotten unstuck, right? Give yourself credit for that and then say, okay, here's the next area. Here's the next thing I'm working on. Because I think growth when it comes to grief is something that we're always going to be working on. It's a journey, it's not a destination. And I think that gives me a little more space to explore. So it's not something like, oh, I have to get this done. It's not something on your to-do list. It's an opportunity to explore and to learn more. So I hope that helps. I really do. Resilience is your capacity to recover quickly. I want to help you recover from the challenges of grief more quickly so that you can find ways to find your path back to happiness again. So thank you so much for watching today. Keep your comments coming. As always, you can reach out to me at email. Oh my goodness, what is my email? GriefInspired@gmail.com. GriefInspired@gmail.com. Sometimes it's a tongue twister for me. Wow, RW, I'm so happy to hear that you think this channel has saved your life. That is amazing, and I'm humbled by that. Please send me an email at GriefInspired@gmail.com and tell me how. I would love to hear from you more about that. So thank you again. I'm going to be figuring out what my next course is going to look like. I'm changing things up, doing things a little bit differently. We're going to take everything that was great from the last one and we're going to pour it into a new one and change it up a little bit for you and make it better, because again, I'm constantly growing and I want you to grow with me, and we can do this together. So if you are here, if you have found my channel, even if you have no friends, no one to talk to, no family, you have me and you have this community of people. So you are no longer alone. Bye for now.